They fined me $50,000 for building a dam, and they did it with smiles on their faces like they were proud of themselves for finally breaking me. The dam wasn't decorative, it wasn't political, and it wasn't optional. It was the only thing standing between their entire neighborhood and a floodplain they had ignored for years. HOA Karen didn't care about facts, engineering, or water flow. She cared about control, and the moment I stopped asking permission and started solving problems, she decided I needed to be punished. The fine didn't come with a warning, it came like an execution notice. Bold numbers, aggressive language, and a deadline designed to cause panic. They told me the dam was illegal, dangerous, and a threat to the community, even though the only thing it threatened was their ability to pretend nothing was wrong. HOA Karen stood behind a deputy when they delivered the threat, wearing that satisfied look people get when they think authority makes them untouchable. She told me I would remove the dam immediately or face arrest, fines, and court action, and she said it slowly so she could enjoy every word. I didn't argue in that moment because I could already see the end of this story forming in my head. The dam was holding back water, but HOA Karen was holding back consequences, and I knew gravity doesn't negotiate. They thought forcing me to tear it down would end the problem, but all it did was remove the last thing protecting them from their own negligence. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? When I finally agreed to remove the dam, HOA Karen looked relieved, like she had just won a war without realizing she had stepped off a cliff. The fine stayed in place, the threats stayed active, and the neighborhood went back to pretending the creek didn't exist. I dismantled the dam slowly and carefully, documenting every inch, every stone, every section of concrete, because I already knew I'd need proof of what came next. The day the dam came down, the sky didn't look dramatic, but the forecast said otherwise, and water has a way of keeping appointments. By nightfall, the rain started, steady at first, then heavy, then relentless, and by morning the creek had become a brown, fast-moving ribbon of inevitability. Without the dam, the water had nowhere to slow down, nowhere to redirect, nowhere to wait its turn. It surged straight into the lowest parts of the neighborhood, the same areas HOA Karen had dismissed as exaggerated complaints. Backyards disappeared first, then sheds, then garages, and then panic set in as water crept toward foundations. Phones started ringing, doors started opening, and suddenly the problem HOA Karen fined me for fixing became everyone's emergency. I stood on my porch watching water reclaim the land it always intended to take, and for the first time since this started, I didn't feel angry. HOA Karen didn't show up right away because confidence collapses faster than concrete when it meets reality. When she finally did arrive, she wasn't smirking anymore. She was shouting into her phone, demanding someone fix what she had ordered destroyed. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact were now demanding answers, asking why the only solution had been forced out of existence. The dam hadn't failed, the HOA had, and there was no way to spin that once the water was visible from every window. Emergency crews arrived, not because I broke a rule, but because HOA Karen enforced one without understanding what it was protecting them from. Sandbags went down where common sense should have been years earlier, and suddenly the word illegal stopped meaning anything compared to the word flooded. HOA Karen tried to blame the weather, then the creek, then me, but water doesn't care about narratives. Every inch the flood advanced erased another excuse, another justification, another threat she had made. By the time the rain stopped, the damage was done, and the neighborhood looked like a before and after photo nobody wanted to share. The fine still existed on paper, but the consequences existed in mud, water lines, ruined equipment, and insurance calls. I didn't celebrate, I documented, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. HOA Karen had created a disaster by enforcing power instead of understanding responsibility, and now there was no dam left to hide behind. The shock wasn't that the neighborhood flooded. The shock was how fast authority evaporated once its decisions became visible. People don't forgive easily when they realize a problem was solved, punished, and then resurrected by ego. That was the moment everything shifted, because once the water went where the dam used to stand, everyone finally saw what HOA Karen had destroyed. I didn't wake up one morning looking for a fight with an HOA, and I didn't build the dam because I wanted to challenge authority or make a statement. I built it because I've lived on that land long enough to understand what water does when people pretend it doesn't exist. I've owned that house for decades, long before HOA Karen learned how to weaponize bylaws, and long before board meetings turned into power theaters instead of problem-solving sessions. I raised my family there, paid my dues, followed the rules that actually made sense, and fixed things myself when the people paid to manage them refused to act. That history mattered, because it meant I wasn't guessing, and I wasn't panicking. I knew exactly what the land did every spring, every heavy rain. Every year the creek swelled past its banks like it was reminding everyone who really owned the low ground. I had complained the polite way first, with emails, calls, and documented photos sent to the HOA over several years, each one showing water creeping closer to homes that were never designed to sit in a swamp. HOA Karen responded the same way every time, with dismissive language and committee delays that led nowhere. She called it a seasonal inconvenience and suggested homeowners adjust landscaping, as if mulch and optimism could stop a watershed. The authority I had wasn't loud or official, but it was earned, built from experience, observation, and responsibility. I wasn't guessing about drainage, and I wasn't experimenting on a whim. I was responding to a pattern the HOA had already admitted existed but refused to fund. When you live somewhere long enough, you stop needing permission to recognize danger, and that's exactly what irritated HOA Karen the most. Her authority depended on people waiting, asking, and giving up when nothing happened. The dam broke that cycle because it worked immediately, and success exposes negligence faster than complaints ever do. I didn't hire contractors because I didn't need to. I understood the flow, the bottleneck, and the runoff channel that had been ignored since the neighborhood was built. I planned it carefully, stayed on my property line, and documented everything from materials to placement, because experience teaches you that success alone isn't enough when ego is involved. HOA Karen didn't see a solution when she looked at the dam. She saw a challenge to her relevance, because it proved something she never wanted acknowledged, that the HOA had failed and someone else had stepped in. Authority like hers doesn't come from knowledge. It comes from enforcement, and enforcement hates being made unnecessary. That's why the fine wasn't proportional. It was theatrical, designed to scare, humiliate, and reassert dominance. $50,000 wasn't a correction. It was a message, and the message said stay in your lane, even if that lane floods. The deputy didn't know the history, the engineering, or the years of ignored warnings. He only knew he was standing next to HOA Karen and holding papers that looked official enough to end the conversation. Authority often relies on appearances, and HOA Karen leaned on that hard, confident most people wouldn't push back once law enforcement was involved. What she underestimated was that I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was observing structurally, and structure always reveals stress points. I kept records not because I wanted to fight, but because experience had taught me that authority without accountability always leaves a paper trail. Every email from the HOA, every delayed response, every acknowledgement of flooding without action became part of a timeline that didn't need interpretation. The dam wasn't a rogue project. It was the last step in a chain of ignored responsibility, and anyone who bothered to look could see that. HOA Karen's authority was built on compliance, not competence. And when competence shows up uninvited, compliance becomes aggression. She framed the dam as unauthorized construction because acknowledging it as emergency mitigation would have required admitting the HOA had failed its duty. She framed it as dangerous because fear justifies punishment faster than facts. She framed it as a community threat because isolating the builder makes enforcement easier than admitting collective risk. I understood that framing immediately because I'd seen it before, not in HOAs, but in any system where control matters more than outcomes. The authority I carried wasn't backed by a title or a gavel. It was backed by preparation, documentation, and the simple reality that water behaves the same way regardless of who is in charge. When HOA Karen fined me, she thought she was restoring order, But all she really did was set a timeline she couldn't control. The decision to remove the dam wasn't surrender, it was compliance under protest, and there's a difference that authority figures often forget exists. I didn't argue publicly, because arguing would have turned this into a personality conflict instead of a structural failure. I followed the order precisely, removed the dam completely, and documented compliance down to the last piece of rubble because I wanted no ambiguity about cause and effect. Authority loves ambiguity, but consequences hate it. When the dam came down, the system was exposed to reality without any buffer, and suddenly the HOA's authority was being tested by something it couldn't fine, threaten, or intimidate. The backstory mattered because it showed this wasn't reckless defiance. It was responsible action punished for political convenience. HOA Karen never asked how the dam worked, never requested an independent assessment, never consulted anyone who understood water flow, because curiosity undermines authority when authority is hollow. Her power depended on stopping the solution, not evaluating it. By the time the rain came, the only authority that mattered was gravity, and gravity doesn't care about bylaws, fines, or tone. The flooding didn't happen because I removed the dam. It happened because the HOA forced the removal of the only mitigation in place. That distinction would become impossible to ignore once neighbors started asking questions, comparing timelines, and realizing who had actually protected them and who had punished that protection. Authority built on fear collapses quickly when evidence becomes visible, and the water made everything visible at once. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't a gray area. It was a direct line from enforcement to damage. The backstory established one thing clearly. I didn't create the risk, I responded to it, and HOA Karen used her authority to ensure the risk returned unchecked. Once people understood that, the narrative she relied on stopped working, because authority without results looks very small when standing ankle-deep in water. HOA Karen did not operate alone, and that's the part most people miss when they think these stories are about one bad personality instead of a broken structure. She sat at the top of a small but tightly controlled hierarchy that thrived on silence, fatigue, and the assumption that no one would ever push far enough to force transparency. The board existed on paper, but in practice it functioned as an echo chamber, nodding along while she framed every decision as necessary, urgent, and non-negotiable. Meetings weren't forums, they were announcements, carefully scheduled at inconvenient times and padded with procedural language designed to discourage questions. Homeowners were trained over years to understand that resistance cost time, money, and peace, while compliance was cheaper, even when it hurt. HOA Karen understood that dynamic intimately, and she exploited it with precision. The power structure depended on asymmetry. The HOA could issue fines instantly, while homeowners had to navigate appeals, delays, and vague standards that shifted whenever enforcement required justification. Rules were written broadly enough to be applied selectively, which meant enforcement was never about consistency. It was about leverage. When the dam appeared, it disrupted that leverage because it solved a problem without passing through the HOA's approval pipeline, and worse, it did so visibly. Visibility is dangerous in systems like that because it invites comparison, and comparison leads to questions. HOA Karen's response wasn't to evaluate the solution, it was to reassert dominance, because dominance was the real product the HOA had been delivering for years. The fine wasn't just punitive, it was symbolic, designed to remind everyone watching that solutions must flow upward, never sideways. She invoked safety, legality, and community standards not because they applied, but because those words carry weight when people are conditioned to stop listening after hearing them. The forged documents, the sudden urgency, and the deputy at my door were all parts of the same mechanism. Overwhelm the individual quickly enough that resistance feels futile. HOA Karen relied on the assumption that no homeowner would have the time, energy, or resources to unravel the narrative she presented, and most of the time, she was right. Neighbors had been fined for trivial things before, mailbox colors, grass length, holiday decorations left up a day too long, and each incident reinforced the lesson that compliance was easier than clarity. The board members knew this, and even those who were uncomfortable benefited from not being targeted themselves. Silence became a form of self-preservation, and HOA Karen rewarded it by directing her attention elsewhere. The abuse wasn't loud most of the time. It was administrative, buried in emails, notices, and deadlines that chipped away at people slowly. When someone pushed back, the response escalated quickly, not because the violation was severe, but because dissent had to be crushed before it spread. The power structure required an example now and then, and the dam made me the perfect candidate. I wasn't just a homeowner out of line. I was proof that the HOA wasn't necessary to solve real problems, and that was unacceptable. The deputy's involvement was the most aggressive expression of that structure, because it borrowed authority from outside the HOA to legitimize internal abuse. Law enforcement didn't investigate, they enforced paperwork, and HOA Karen knew exactly how to exploit that gap. She presented confidence, documents, and urgency, and that was enough to turn a civil disagreement into a threat of arrest. That moment wasn't about water or property. It was about showing the neighborhood how far she could go if challenged. The structure protected her because accountability moved slower than enforcement, and by the time truth caught up, damage would already be done. What made the abuse effective was that it was incremental, each step justified by the last, creating a chain that looked reasonable if you didn't stop to examine it. First a fine, then a warning, then legal language, then law enforcement. Each escalation framed as a consequence of non-compliance rather than an abuse of authority. HOA Karen never had to admit she was wrong. She only had to insist she was in charge. The board's complicity wasn't active conspiracy. It was passive surrender. And that surrender is what allowed the abuse to feel normal. When I removed the dam, I didn't break the structure. I stepped out of it. And that's when its flaws became obvious. The system had no contingency for being obeyed and then proven wrong, because it was built on the assumption that obedience meant validation. Once compliance led directly to harm, the structure had no narrative left to protect itself. The flooding didn't just damage property, it exposed the HOA's power as performative rather than protective. Neighbors who had stayed quiet because enforcement felt abstract were suddenly dealing with water in their yards, mud in their homes, and losses that no fine could undo. The abuse became tangible, and tangible consequences travel faster than warnings ever do. HOA Karen's structure depended on controlling information, but water doesn't respect information control. It shows up everywhere at once. As neighbors compared notes, timelines, and notices, patterns emerged that had been invisible when each person thought they were alone. The same language, the same threats, the same dismissive responses appeared across different disputes, and suddenly the abuse had a shape. The power structure couldn't survive that level of scrutiny because it was never designed to withstand it. It relied on fragmentation, on each homeowner believing their experience was isolated. Once the dam was gone and the flooding returned, fragmentation collapsed into shared reality. HOA Karen still had the title, the letterhead, and the boardroom, but she no longer had credibility, and credibility is the only thing that makes authority function when enforcement fails. The abuse had always been there, but it took a visible consequence to make people admit it, and once admitted, it couldn't be put back behind meeting minutes and fines. The moment the dam came down, the truth stopped being theoretical and started soaking into the ground, and that's when discovery stopped being something I chased and became something I documented. I didn't celebrate compliance, I recorded it, because instinct told me that if this turned ugly, the timeline would matter more than my intentions. I photographed the dismantling from multiple angles, time-stamped everything, and kept copies of the court order visible in frame, because I already understood how easily narratives could be rewritten once damage appeared. When the rain started, it didn't arrive dramatically, it arrived steadily. The kind of rain locals recognize as dangerous not because it's loud, but because it doesn't stop. Within hours, the creek began to swell in the same familiar way it had for years, only this time there was nothing to slow it. I set up my camera exactly where it had been before, pointed at the same landmarks, so no one could claim conditions were different. The water rose predictably, methodically, and then aggressively, spreading into yards that had been dry for months. By morning, the evidence was undeniable. Lawns were submerged, sheds were flooded, and property damage was no longer hypothetical. I didn't interfere, I didn't intervene, and I didn't try to fix anything, because proof requires restraint. Every hour, I logged water levels, weather data, and visual changes, cross-referencing rainfall reports with footage so no one could argue coincidence. Neighbors began calling, not angrily, but urgently, and I asked each of them the same thing. Document everything, take photos, save receipts, don't touch anything yet. What had been dismissed as an individual improvement suddenly revealed itself as a community safeguard, and that shift reframed every prior action the HOA had taken. The discovery phase wasn't about uncovering hidden documents anymore. It was about aligning cause and effect so clearly that denial would sound absurd. I pulled out every old HOA email acknowledging flooding concerns, every delayed response, every cost-prohibitive excuse, and placed them next to images of current damage. The contrast was devastating. The HOA had known about the risk, declined to act, punished the solution, and then forced its removal. And now the neighborhood was paying the price in real time. Proof stopped being something I assembled alone and became something neighbors contributed to willingly. George documented his ruined equipment, Clara logged cleanup costs, and others measured water intrusion near foundations, all following the same structure, so the data was consistent. We weren't reacting emotionally. We were building a record. I requested official rainfall data from the county to eliminate any claim of abnormal conditions, and the report confirmed what locals already knew. The storm was heavy, but not exceptional. That detail mattered, because it destroyed the argument that the flooding was unavoidable. The discovery process also extended to HOA behavior after the flood, and that's where their panic became visible. Emails shifted tone, language softened, and responsibility blurred as messages stopped coming from HOA Karen directly and started appearing unsigned or on behalf of the board. That transition alone was proof of internal fracture. I archived everything, including message metadata, because accountability hides in details people assume no one will check. When the HOA attempted to circulate a statement blaming unforeseen natural events, I compared it line by line with prior communications that acknowledged the same conditions years earlier. The contradiction was blatant. I also requested copies of the documents used to justify the original fine and injunction, knowing that once scrutiny increased, inconsistencies would surface. Sure enough, dates didn't align, citations referenced outdated codes, and signatures appeared on documents that hadn't existed at the time they were supposedly issued. I didn't accuse anyone yet. I just organized the discrepancies chronologically, letting the story tell itself. The proof wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative, each piece reinforcing the last, until denial required deliberate blindness. When neighbors saw the compiled timeline, something shifted, not just in opinion, but in confidence. People stopped whispering and started asking direct questions because the facts gave them footing. Discovery also meant understanding motive, and financial records became impossible to ignore. HOA budgets showed repeated allocations for water management assessments that never resulted in action, while legal expenses spiked immediately after the dam appeared. That correlation mattered because it suggested enforcement wasn't about safety. It was about preserving authority and avoiding exposure. I submitted formal records requests, knowing they would either comply or reveal further obstruction. Delays followed, then partial disclosures, and finally silence, each response more telling than the last. Proof thrives on patterns, and the HOA's pattern was avoidance. I didn't need a confession. I needed consistency, and they provided it unintentionally. When the local news reached out after hearing rumors of flooding and conflict, I didn't pitch a story. I offered documentation. I showed them the dam working, the order to remove it, the removal itself, and the resulting damage, all time-stamped, all verifiable. Journalists don't need outrage. They need evidence, and I gave them a sequence no editor could ignore. The discovery phase ended the moment the narrative left HOA-controlled channels and entered public record, because once facts are externalized, they can't be quietly buried. HOA Karen tried to reassert control with statements and denials, but each word she spoke could now be cross-checked against documented reality. That's the difference between authority and accountability. One relies on position, the other on proof. By the time officials began asking questions, the discovery phase had already done its work. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was organized, shared, and impossible to dismiss without implicating everyone involved. The dam had been removed, the neighborhood had flooded, and the record showed exactly why. All that remained was confrontation, and this time it wouldn't happen behind closed doors. Confrontation didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It unfolded as pressure applied from every direction at once, and HOA Karen was the last person to realize she was standing at the center of it. The first crack appeared when residents started asking for explanations instead of accepting reassurances, because once people see proof with their own eyes, scripted responses lose their power. The flooded yards weren't abstract complaints anymore. They were visible damage, and every soaked foundation and ruined tool was a reminder that enforcement decisions had consequences. HOA Karen attempted to regain control the way she always had, through emails that sounded official but said very little, leaning on vague phrases like ongoing assessment and unavoidable weather events. But this time those words landed flat. People replied publicly, attaching photos, receipts, and timestamps, and suddenly her inbox became a ledger of accountability instead of a command center. The board meeting she scheduled was meant to restore order, but the very act of calling it created a stage she could no longer control. Attendance exceeded capacity, not because residents were curious, but because they were angry and prepared. I arrived early and sat quietly, documents organized, not because I needed to speak first, but because I understood that confrontation works best when others speak before you. When HOA Karen opened the meeting, her tone was clipped and defensive, skipping pleasantries and moving straight into damage control. But she underestimated how thoroughly the narrative had shifted. The first resident to speak didn't ask a question. He read a timeline aloud, listing dates when flooding complaints were ignored, followed by the date the dam was built, the date it was removed, and the date his basement flooded. That structure mattered, because it mirrored the documentation everyone had already seen, and it forced the room to follow the same logical path. HOA Karen tried to interrupt, citing procedural rules, but the room didn't yield, because procedure only works when people believe it protects them. One by one, residents stood, not ranting, not yelling, but presenting facts, and each statement narrowed the space she had left to maneuver. She attempted to deflect blame onto contractors, weather, and even homeowners themselves, but every deflection was met with evidence contradicting it. When she claimed the storm was unprecedented, someone projected county rainfall data. When she suggested the dam had caused upstream issues, footage played showing the water behaving exactly as designed. The confrontation escalated not through volume, but through accumulation, and that made it impossible to dismiss as emotion. I waited until the room was already aligned with the facts before I spoke, because timing is everything when collapse is inevitable. When I stood, I didn't accuse her of malice. I asked her to explain decisions already documented. I asked why the HOA fined a solution after acknowledging the problem for years, and why the enforcement escalated only after she personally intervened. Her responses grew shorter, less coherent, and eventually contradictory, because lies don't scale under scrutiny. Someone asked about the legal basis for the fine, and when she referenced documents already proven inconsistent, the room reacted audibly, not with shouting, but with disbelief. That sound, the collective realization that authority had been misused, marked the point of no return. The board members sitting beside her began to shift uncomfortably, because public collapse doesn't only threaten the person at the center, it exposes everyone who enabled them. A motion was raised to suspend enforcement actions pending investigation, and for the first time, HOA Karen objected not on procedural grounds, but emotionally, warning of chaos and loss of control. That warning backfired because it revealed what this had always been about: control rather than community. The vote passed despite her objections, and the room changed instantly because power had visibly shifted away from her. She attempted to adjourn the meeting, but the bylaws required a majority vote, and that majority no longer supported her. The confrontation became public not because of raised voices, but because decisions were now being made without her consent. When financial records were requested openly, she hesitated, citing confidentiality. But confidentiality only protects when trust exists, and that trust was gone. The board voted to open records to an independent review, and the implications of that decision landed hard. HOA Karen's posture changed from defiant to guarded, because collapse isn't loud at first. It's internal. Residents who had once avoided eye contact now spoke directly, asking about legal expenses, enforcement priorities, and personal involvement in decisions that had caused harm. She answered some, evaded others, and that pattern spoke louder than any accusation. The confrontation reached its peak, not with a dramatic outburst, but with silence, when she was asked a simple question she couldn't answer without implicating herself. That silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand what it meant. When the meeting finally adjourned, it wasn't because she ended it, but because the room had extracted everything it needed. The collapse continued outside the meeting hall, where conversations formed clusters of consensus, and residents compared notes instead of rumors. Media attention followed naturally, not because anyone sought it, but because public accountability invites scrutiny. HOA Karen issued a statement the next day, attempting to reframe events. But by then, the narrative was no longer hers to shape. Each attempt to minimize damage was met with another release of documentation, and the more she spoke, the more exposed she became. The board convened again without her, citing governance concerns, and that exclusion marked the final stage of collapse, where authority exists in name only. By the time formal proceedings began to review her actions, the outcome was already decided in the court of public trust. Confrontation had done its work not by destroying her publicly, but by removing the illusion that allowed her to operate unchecked. The neighborhood didn't cheer, it recalibrated, because justice doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it arrives with clarity. HOA Karen's power evaporated quietly, replaced by a collective resolve to prevent anything like this from happening again. The collapse wasn't dramatic, it was structural. And once the supports were gone, nothing was holding her position upright anymore. Expert retaliation didn't look like anger or shouting. It looked like paperwork, credentials, and methodical pressure applied by people who understood systems better than HOA Karen ever had. Once the board voted to open records and suspend enforcement, the door was open for professionals who had been watching quietly to step forward. And when they did, the tone of the entire situation changed. Engineers don't speculate, auditors don't assume, and attorneys don't bluff when documentation is available, and that combination was devastating to someone whose authority had relied on intimidation rather than accuracy. The first expert to engage was a civil engineer retained by the board, not by me, which mattered because it removed any claim of bias. His report didn't praise the dam or criticize it emotionally. It simply analyzed what existed, what was removed, and what happened afterward. He documented pre-dam flooding patterns, post-dam mitigation, and the immediate correlation between removal and damage, laying out causation in language that left no room for reinterpretation. That report alone reframed the issue from a rule violation into a liability question, and liability changes everything. The HOA's insurer was notified next. And insurance companies don't care about politics or personalities, they care about risk exposure. Once the insurer requested documentation, timelines, and decision logs, the scope widened beyond a neighborhood dispute into a financial reckoning. Adjusters walked properties, photographed damage, and interviewed residents, not asking who was at fault, but establishing loss. And every loss traced back to a decision HOA Karen had pushed through unilaterally. Meanwhile, a forensic accountant reviewed enforcement fines, legal expenses, and emergency assessments, identifying patterns that suggested selective enforcement rather than uniform governance. That distinction mattered because selective enforcement isn't just unethical, it's legally vulnerable. As experts compiled findings independently, their conclusions aligned in ways HOA Karen couldn't dismiss as coincidence. The dam wasn't an unauthorized hazard, it was a functional mitigation measure responding to documented neglect. The fine wasn't proportional, it was punitive. The removal wasn't precautionary, it was reckless. Each expert report reinforced the others, creating a network of credibility that replaced rhetoric with evidence. HOA Karen attempted to counter this by hiring her own consultant, but credibility can't be purchased after the fact, especially when prior actions contradict current claims. Her consultant's statements were cautious, hedged, and carefully worded because even he couldn't dispute the observable outcomes. When questioned about alternative mitigation plans proposed before removal, he admitted none existed, and that admission landed harder than any accusation I could have made. Legal counsel for the board then stepped in, not to defend past actions, but to contain future damage, and their advice was blunt. Continuing to support HOA Karen's decisions would expose the association to lawsuits it couldn't afford. That wasn't speculation. It was risk assessment, and board members who had once deferred to her now listened closely, because personal liability concentrates attention. Expert retaliation also extended beyond reports into formal complaints. A regulatory inquiry was opened regarding the HOA's authority to levy fines of that magnitude without due process, and that inquiry required sworn statements. Sworn statements change behavior because lying becomes dangerous. HOA Karen's responses shifted from assertive to evasive, and evasiveness is a red flag to investigators trained to notice it. Environmental consultants reviewed water management compliance and concluded that the dam's design posed no ecological harm, undermining the justification used to demand its removal. At the same time, municipal engineers reviewed historical drainage plans and confirmed that the HOA had inherited unresolved issues it never addressed. Those findings reframed the narrative yet again, positioning the dam not as a rogue act, but as an informal solution filling a governance vacuum. Expert retaliation gained momentum not because anyone coordinated it centrally, but because truth attracts corroboration. Each professional approached the situation independently, yet arrived at conclusions that reinforced each other, and that convergence made dismissal impossible. HOA Karen attempted to discredit experts by questioning motives, but that tactic failed because the experts weren't advocating for me. They were documenting reality. The board's legal counsel advised immediate remediation efforts and settlement discussions, signaling an institutional shift away from confrontation. At that point, retaliation wasn't about punishment, it was about correction, and correction requires authority to change hands. HOA Karen was formally removed from decision-making pending investigation, and that removal stripped her of the platform she'd used to exert pressure. Experts continued their work without interference, and their final reports were distributed to all residents, not summarized, not filtered, but shared in full. Transparency turned outrage into understanding, and understanding into consensus. The retaliation was expert because it attacked the problem at its root, not the person's character, but the systems she'd misused. Financial projections showed the cost of ignoring expert advice compared to implementing it, and the difference was stark enough to silence remaining opposition. When remediation plans were proposed, they included professionally engineered drainage improvements, funded collectively, and designed to prevent future flooding, without reliance on improvised solutions. That plan validated what the dam had represented conceptually, even if it replaced it physically, and that validation mattered. HOA Karen attempted one last appeal, framing herself as a scapegoat. But experts don't scapegoat. They isolate variables, and the variable consistently linked to harm was her decision-making. By the time final recommendations were issued, the outcome was procedural, not emotional. Enforcement policies were rewritten, fine structures recalibrated, and decision thresholds raised to require expert consultation before action. That systemic change was the real retaliation, because it ensured no one could repeat what she'd done. The neighborhood didn't seek revenge. It sought insulation from future abuse, and experts provided that insulation. When liability settlements were finalized, they included compensation for damage, restoration of affected properties, and reimbursement of improperly levied fines. Each check issued explicit acknowledgement that authority had failed and expertise had corrected it. HOA Karen's name appeared only in appendices and footnotes, where accountability belongs, not in headlines. Expert retaliation ended not with a verdict shouted, but with policies signed, systems corrected, and risks neutralized. It was quiet, thorough, and irreversible, the kind of outcome that doesn't feel dramatic in the moment but reshapes everything afterward. Total victory didn't arrive with celebration, raised voices, or public speeches. It arrived the way real power shifts always do, quietly, when the person who once dominated the room no longer mattered enough to be addressed. By the time the final documents were signed and distributed, HOA Karen was no longer a figure anyone debated or feared. She was an administrative afterthought, a name attached to past errors rather than present authority. The neighborhood didn't need an apology tour or a dramatic reckoning, because the structure that allowed her behavior had already been dismantled, and structures matter more than personalities. Board meetings resumed with new rules, shorter agendas, and longer disclosures, and for the first time in years, no one walked into those meetings tense or defensive. Residents spoke plainly, votes were recorded transparently, and decisions were grounded in data rather than ego. The flooding issue, once weaponized as a pretext for punishment, was resolved through professionally engineered solutions that worked without drama, and the irony was impossible to miss. The dam that had triggered everything was gone, but the principle behind it had been adopted officially, validated by experts, and funded collectively. That validation was the quiet acknowledgement that the problem had never been the solution, only the person who tried to crush it. Financial restitution followed methodically, not as a favor, but as an obligation, and checks were issued without ceremony, each one closing a loop that HOA Karen had opened recklessly. Neighbors didn't gloat. They simply repaired what had been damaged and moved on, because vindication doesn't require spectacle when the outcome speaks for itself. The HOA's revised bylaws were distributed in full, not summarized, and residents actually read them this time, because trust had been broken once, and no one intended to let that happen again. Enforcement powers were narrowed, appeal processes expanded, and independent review requirements embedded so deeply that unilateral action was no longer possible. Those changes ensured that no future board president could replicate what HOA Karen had done, even if they wanted to. As weeks passed, her absence became unremarkable, which was perhaps the most humiliating outcome of all. There were no whispered conversations about her return, no speculation about her influence, no fear of retaliation, just normalcy returning to a place that had been distorted by control. When her name surfaced, it was only in reference to why certain safeguards existed, a cautionary example rather than a threat. The neighborhood learned without needing a lesson spelled out, and that learning settled into habit. Property values stabilized, then improved, not because of marketing, but because stability attracts confidence, and confidence attracts investment. New families moved in unaware of the conflict that had preceded them, benefiting quietly from protections they never had to fight for. That, more than anything, marked the victory as complete. HOA Karen attempted no comeback, issued no statements, filed no challenges, because every avenue that once amplified her voice now required consensus, documentation, and scrutiny she could not bypass. Silence followed her not as a punishment, but as a consequence, and consequences are always more enduring. The last formal action related to her tenure was a brief line in the minutes noting the closure of outstanding matters, a procedural sentence that reduced months of intimidation into a footnote. No one lingered on it, no one argued, and no one asked follow-up questions. Life resumed on its own terms, unbothered by the person who once tried to control it. The victory wasn't loud, and it wasn't emotional. It was structural, legal, and final, the kind that leaves nothing to reclaim. HOA Karen went silent.